in our audience, and I think you're going to be in for a really interesting lecture today. I'm going to get started. Ich heiße Vivian Felsen und ich bin ein Mitglied für das Komitee für Yiddish bei der Toronto Jiddische Föderation, and I'm one of the, ich bin eine von den Anführers, the hosts for today's program. Die andere Host ist Sharon Power, whom you just heard, und ihr wollten wir nicht gekehrt von unser Zoom-Programm. Wir sind geworden so nötig beschäftigt dem Covid-19. Sie ist jetzt vernommen mit euch in unser Wartsaal und hereinlassen die Menschen, welche haben sich verschrieben für unser heutiges Referat. Mehr wie 100 Menschen haben sich verschrieben. Und der Fall wird es nehmen ein bisschen Zeit. Und wir danken euch alle für eure Geduld und ein Dank für eure Kommenheit. Ich will euch danken, Anastasia Lubas. Sie ist eine andere von den Einführern. Sie ist euch von unserem Komitee für Yiddish. Und sie hat eingeladen, Rachel Seelig zu sein, unser Gastredner, in Verbindung mit Holocaust Education Week. Und ich will euch danken, der Toronto Arbiter Ring, der Toronto Workmen Circle, unser Schutif beim heutigen Programm und befragt Mel Zederboim, der Direktor. So welcome everybody. I hope that all of you, how many of you, you can raise your hand, how many of you understood Yiddish or understand Yiddish? Good, I think everybody, that's great. So I just wanted to say that my name is Vivian Felsen. As you already heard, I'm one of your co-hosts for today. And oh dear, I've got to get rid of my phone. As a member of the Committee for Yiddish, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Yiddish lecture. Just forgive me for one moment, and I'm going to get rid of this phone. I apologize for that. I'm going to blame my husband who reassured me that the phone was off. Anyway, now, our other co-host for today is Sharon Power, whose voice you heard before, and she's monitoring the waiting room. She's very busy checking the list of registrants. And our other co-host is Anastasia Lubas, who you can see somewhere on the screen. And she's also a member of our committee and one of the Yiddish teachers like Sharon. And as I mentioned, we have 100 registrants for today's program, over 100. So I do have a few announcements, and I'm going to make them in English to make sure that everybody understands. And ich hoffe, als alle du verstehen ein bisschen English. First of all, we've muted all the microphones because we want them muted we want you to keep them on mute during the lecture. The talk will be about 40 minutes, and afterwards there will be time for a Q&A, and you'll be able to unmute yourself manually during the question and answer period. So please put any questions that you have in the chat box. You can address it to everybody, nobody in particular. And you'll be able to ask questions also afterwards. And something else that's very important, we're asking that when the lecture begins, please turn off your videos. That you should be on speaker view so that you can see Rachel, and also she'll be sharing slides, so you want to have a good view of her slides. So it is less distracting to all the rest of us if all the videos are off. So we're asking you to do that. You can turn, as soon as the talk is over, you can turn your videos back on. And feel free to ask your questions in both Yiddish or English, whatever you prefer. Und jetzt im Namen von der Komitee für Yiddish bei der Toronto Jiddische Föderation und der Toronto Arbeiterin ist es mein großes Vorrecht, vorzustellen unser Gastredner, Dr. Rachel Seelig, who you can see on the screen. Rachel Seelig hat bekommen ihr PhD bei der Chicago Universität in 2011. Sie verinteressiert sich mit die moderne jiddische Literatur, Modern Jewish Literature, die fragt jiddische Literatur geschrieben auf Jiddisch und Hebräisch. Und euch die Werke von Schreiber, welche haben geschrieben, jiddische Schreiber, welche haben geschrieben auf Deutsch. Kurz ihr Artikeln, wo sind erschienen in verschiedene akademische Zeitschriften, hat sie herausgegeben ein Buch in 2016 mit dem Titel Strangers in Berlin, Modern Jewish Literature Between East and West, 1919 to 1930. Vor dem Buch ist sie anerkannt geworden mit einer von den Canadian Jewish Literary Awards in 2017. Und ich habe das Buch, ich habe es gelernt und es ist sehr, sehr interessant. Dr. Rachel Seelig is a scholar of modern Jewish literature and the author of Strangers in Berlin that I just mentioned, which won a Canadian Jewish Literary Award in 2017. Her articles and translations have appeared in academic journals and other periodicals. She has taught and held fellowships at the University of Toronto, the Hebrew University, the University of Michigan, Columbia University, and Harvard. And it is now my pleasure to present Rachel Seelig.
Schönen Dank, Vivian. Es ist also schön, Yiddish zu hören. Ich will over auf English reden, mit ein bisschen Yiddish. So thank you all for being here. It's one of the pleasures of being able to lecture over Zoom is actually hearing phones ring and seeing people's bookshelves, and it's kind of a Hamish experience, even though we're over 100 people gathered here. And I cannot see any of you, but I see a lot of the names, many of them familiar. So thank you for being here. And many of them I don't know, but I look forward to hopefully hearing from you during the Q&A after my talk. It's always a little unnerving to speak over Zoom. I currently have various devices balanced on books and my hamper and all kinds of things. So let's hope this all holds. If there are any issues while I'm speaking, any problems suddenly hearing me, please just write a comment in the chat and we'll be able to pause and take care of that. So with that, I will begin. The title of my talk today is On the Edge of the Volcano, and I'll tell you where that quote is from shortly. Yiddish literature in Berlin before the Third Reich. And as Vivian pointed out, that's also, she mentioned the book that I wrote, Strangers in Berlin. So this is very much, this talk very much comes out of that book. So thank you for mentioning that, Vivian. And thank you, I also just want to say thank you quickly to Sharon Power and to Anastasia Lubas for coordinating and inviting me and pulling this all together. It's no small feat. So you all know that Berlin is the capital of Germany. But what I want to suggest today is that Berlin was once also a Jewish capital. Berlin was a place where Jewish culture thrived, particularly between the two world wars. So this talk is taking place in the context of Holocaust Education Week. But what I'm going to be focusing on today is actually the moment just preceding the Holocaust, a time when Jewish culture and especially Yiddish culture really thrived in Europe and even in Berlin. When I say that Berlin was once a Jewish capital, I'm not just referring to the German Jewish culture that took root there, which we're all, I'm sure, familiar with in some form or another. During the interwar period, Berlin was the site of a transnational, multilingual Jewish culture that flourished not only in German, but also in Hebrew, in Russian, and of course in Yiddish. So as Jews, I think we tend to think of Berlin as the place where Hitler forcibly took power in 1933. We think of the decimation of European Jewish culture. But Berlin was also a place where Jewish culture thrived, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So if you've ever been to Berlin in recent years, you probably visited the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, that striking, massive memorial by Peter Eisenman. You probably remember the chilling memory voids in Daniel Liebeskind's famous Jewish museum. You might have even visited the infamous villa at Wannsee, where the final solution was designed. And these are, of course, really important pieces of history, really important sites to visit, but they shouldn't overshadow the Jewish life and culture that once thrived in Berlin, that maybe today is slightly less visible, but that's what I want to bring to your attention today. So I'm going to talk to you today, dafka, about Berlin as a Yiddish center. And this is an important but sometimes overlooked chapter of Yiddish culture. So I'm going to be focusing really on three questions. Why Berlin? What made Berlin attractive to Yiddish writers? Why would they go there? Second, what impact did Berlin's culture have on these writers? And I'll talk to you about a couple of examples, a couple of writers. And then finally, what can we consider what is the legacy of this moment in history? How should we remember this? And why is it significant today? So first of all, why Berlin? Berlin was attractive because it was eternally young. It was even nicknamed in German, die ewig junge Stadt, the eternally young city. And it was eternally young because it was constantly reinventing itself. So if we zoom back about 100 years, World War I ends in 1918, right? And Germany, the aggressor and loser in the war, is forced under the Treaty of Versailles, under what was called the War Guilt Clause, to pay massive reparations that would actually soon bring it to near ruin. So this is a really significant moment, a really significant change on the European landscape. I'm just going to bring up my slide here. Right, so 1918, World War I ends. The Treaty of Versailles is signed. Berlin is required to take sole guilt for the atrocities of the war, pay massive reparations. And this moment is also marks the end of the multi-ethnic empires and the birth of new nation states across the European continent. In 1919, a republic is established in Germany. So this is the first democracy that Germany has known, and it takes its name from the city where its constitution was signed, Weimar. Berlin, which was formerly the small, sleepy capital of the Prussian Empire, is completely transformed. It becomes the capital of this new democracy, the Weimar Republic. And it's clearly time for a national makeover, right? There is a complete distrust now in the authorities that were responsible for bringing Germany into the First World War to begin with. This is, sorry for the typo, that should say George Gross. This is a painting by George Gross, very famous German artist from the period, called The Pillars of Society. And I think it really reflects the sort of anxiety and distrust of authority that characterized this particular moment in history. The painting portrays three quote unquote pillars of society. You have on the left, the journalist, in the center, the war general, the military general, and on the right, the politician. And if you look closely and you see what's on or inside each of their heads, on the far left, the journalist has a chamber pot on his head. When I ask my college students what that is, most of them think it's an oversized teacup because they've never heard of a chamber pot. In the center, the general, right, who has a war horse climbing out of his head, right? So all he cares about is war and fighting. And then finally on the right, you've got the politician who, George Gross doesn't pull any punches here. Basically, the guy's got shit for brains. He's just got a big steaming turd in his head. And this is the way Gross is portraying the pillars of society, the authority figures, those who were responsible for bringing Germany to its knees in the First World War, and those who no longer are deserving of the public's trust. So it's really time for a national makeover, as I said. It's time to reinvent German identity, and time to reinvent German identity in such a way that it's much more appealing internationally. And this is part of the reason that Berlin becomes a place that is so attractive to immigrants. Now, almost overnight, Berlin is completely transformed physically. It explodes into a metropolis. The Greater Berlin Act of 1920 united the old city, which if you look at this slide, you can see it outlined kind of faintly in yellow at the center of the map. That was the old Berlin, the Prussian Berlin. And it was united with all of its surrounding towns and villages to form this massive, sprawling metropolis, a massive city of 20 boroughs. This means that the territory of the city increases more than tenfold, and the population also doubles to reach nearly 4 million. So Berlin was now the third largest city in the world, and the second largest in Europe after London. So it's bigger, it's newer. Here's an image of the old Potsdamer Platz. Looks quite different today, but you can see how bustling it was back then. And Berlin becomes this magnet for immigrants from all over Europe and the world. Among them, many East European Jews. Now, the phenomenon of East European Jews traveling to Berlin wasn't new. It actually dates back at least to the 1800s. One of the most sort of well-known dates that we know of is 1743, was the year that a young Yiddish-speaking boy named Moishe Mendelssohn arrived in Berlin from Dessau, and he grew up to become the father of the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, which is really the basis of modern Jewish life as we know it. During the late 19th century, hundreds of thousands of Jews traveled through Berlin as part of the Great Migration westward, and this was set off by violent pogroms that ravaged Eastern Europe. And most of these immigrants really had their sights set on the Goldene Medine, right, America, but Germany, and especially Berlin, was the gateway to the West, and many immigrants stayed there either temporarily or permanently. And many of those who settled often remained in and around Alexanderplatz in the unofficial Jewish quarter known as the Scheunenviertel. And here's an image from around 1930 of what that area looked like. Mix of Hebrew, Yiddish, German on the signs. So by the 1920s, which is the moment I'm focusing on here, there was already a very strong Jewish immigrant presence in Berlin. But it was during the 1920s that the presence of Yiddish-speaking Jews really became palpable. I don't usually resort to statistics, but this one is quite striking. Before World War I, foreign-born Jews made up only 5% of Berlin's Jewish population. And by 1925, they were more than 25%. So this is quite significant, right? When we talk about Berlin Jews, we're not just speaking about German Jews. A quarter of these Jews were from Eastern Europe and were predominantly Yiddish speakers. Berlin became a magnet for artists, writers, and intellectuals from all over Europe and the world, including some of the most prominent Jewish writers of the day, such as Chaim Nachman Bialik, Uri Tzvi Greenberg, Leah Goldberg, Shimon Dubnov, Abraham Joshua Heschel. The list goes on, and I'm not even adding to the list the many artists and musicians who joined their ranks. Many of these writers were escaping civil war and anti-Jewish violence in Eastern Europe. Berlin provided a kind of a temporary escape. It was a way station where they spent time before moving on to a new homeland, whether that new homeland be America Canada, Palestine, the Soviet Union. The Yiddish intellectual Daniel Charney once commented that Berlin was the Transitkretschme, the transit inn, a kind of stopping over point en route to other destinations. And there were three major factors that attracted Yiddish writers to Berlin. One was that it was culturally experimental and liberal. In the aftermath of World War I, as I said, there was this strong push to reinvent German culture, to reinvent European culture. And this was especially visible in Berlin. The kind of key word of the day was new, neu, N-E-U, neu, new. Everything was new. I'll give you a couple more images here to give you a sense of what I mean. So architecture, right, was known as das neue Bauen, the new building. Most prominent movement was the Bauhaus. I've given you here an image of the famous Bauhaus school in Dessau, designed by Walter Gropius, one of the founders of the movement, and a cartoon that gives you a sense of how a makeover of architecture was matched by a makeover of the individual, that people no longer wanted to be associated with that old German identity. They wanted to reinvent themselves. So you had the new architecture, you had the new objectivity in art, made famous by artists like Otto Dix, who had this very detached, cynical, sort of dark view of reality. And there was, of course, also the new woman, die neue Frau, like Marlene Dietrich or Louise Brooks, the American actress who was also famous on the silver screen in Germany. Complete reinvention of female identity to be more liberated, even androgynous at times. So everything was new in Berlin. This culture was supposed to be completely reinvented. And this was, of course, very appealing to Jewish artists looking to create an experimental new culture in Yiddish. So that's the first reason that these artists were so attracted to Berlin. The second is that Berlin was associated with the political left. And in fact, when Hitler came to power in 1933, he charged Joseph Goebbels with the task of turning what he called the reddest city in Europe after Moscow into a brown city, meaning transforming a city that was heavily communist into a brown city, the city of the Nazi Party. This was the main reason that Hitler despised and feared Berlin, because it was so strongly associated with communism. And this was attractive to many East European Jews who identified as either socialist or communist. Berlin's political climate was really welcoming to these left-leaning East European Jews. The Yiddish writer and journalist David Einhorn was actually stationed in Berlin from 1920 to 1924 as a foreign correspondent for the New York Yiddish daily, the Vorwärts, the Forward. And he wrote extensively about the German Communist Party and relations between German Jews and East European Jewish workers. And I want to just read you a quote that's quite striking from one of his articles in the Vorwärts from the 1920s. He wrote, "Berlin is a city of a defeated country where deep mourning fills every place. But one has to admire the fact that people are good towards strangers. You do not feel any mean hatred." Now, from today's perspective, his quote might seem overly optimistic, because soon thereafter, he would feel some pretty mean hatred toward Jews and communists. But at the time, there was this kind of openness, the sense that everyone had a place in Berlin. And the third reason that Berlin was so attractive to these East European newcomers is that it was affordable. Germany's post-war economic situation, which was very problematic. The country had gone into hyperinflation by the early 20s, And this was actually a blessing for migrants who were coming with foreign currency. The Yiddish poet Avram Nochem Stenzel once wrote, and I quote, "A foreigner with a London pound, a Dutch guilder, an American dollar could wander from cabaret to cabaret in Berlin and saunter after midnight along the garishly lit Kurfürstendamm, ending up in a hotel with not one woman, but one on each arm." So, of course, also pointing out the phenomenon of prostitution that ran rampant in Weimar Berlin. But what Stenzel is pointing out in his kind of ironic way is that life was affordable for foreigners in Berlin. Inflation and the increased value of foreign currency made Berlin a paradise for foreign publishers who were in many cases facing censorship in war-torn Eastern Europe. And Yiddish writers really took advantage of this. Between 1920 and 1924, so this was really kind of the heyday of Yiddish literary activity in Berlin, Berlin was second only to Warsaw as the world's largest center of Yiddish book publishing. It produced over 200 titles at its height in 1924. And to give you an idea, this was about a quarter of all Yiddish books produced worldwide that year. Many Yiddish presses were established in Berlin in the 1920s alongside Hebrew presses. And there were countless periodicals that came out in Yiddish in Berlin. And many of these periodicals were known for their modernist, eye-catching aesthetic. I want to show you a couple of examples. So this is an image of the cover of a periodical that came out in both Yiddish and Hebrew, sort of twin editions. It was a bilingual journal called Milgroim in Yiddish, or Limon in Hebrew, meaning pomegranate. And this was a really beautiful, quite unusual journal for art and literature. And what's particularly striking about this journal is that the production value was so high that it was able to be printed in beautiful, rich color, right? This was something that really couldn't be achieved by most printing presses in Eastern Europe because of the political situation, the economic situation. But in Berlin, this was affordable. And another periodical that was published for a couple of years in Berlin was Albatros, founded and edited by Uri Tzvi Greenberg, later became known primarily as a Hebrew poet, but started out as a Yiddish poet and actually in Berlin started to make his transition into writing in Hebrew. But this was also a very, as you can see from the images here, very stark modernist kind of aesthetic, and the literature that was published in it, including a number of his own poems, was often very in your face, very violent, describing the current situation in Eastern Europe. One of Uri Tzvi Greenberg's most famous poems from this period that he published in Albatros while in Berlin is the poem In Malchus von Salem, in the Kingdom of the Cross, which was his epithet for Europe. And I want to read you in Yiddish and then in English just a short quote from that poem to give you a sense of the way he saw Europe and the way he presented it in this journal. Ich will öffnen dem Weiland und ihre Weisen alle Bämer, wo die Mesi meine hängen mit die Fäulendicke Gufim, hob Hanoe Malchus Salem. I want to open up the forest and expose all the trees from which the decaying bodies of my dead hang. Take pleasure, Kingdom of the Cross. So as you can see, this was a very violent poem, a very violent portrayal of Eastern Europe, where Uri Tzvi Greenberg believed there was no future for the Jewish people. And he would actually make his way in 1924 from Berlin to Palestine, where he would become a very staunch right-wing Zionist. But Berlin was the place where he was able to express this violent vision of the kingdom of the cross, this place that was so violent toward its Jewish inhabitants. So just as a quick summary, the three main reasons that East European Jewish writers and intellectuals are so drawn to Berlin is that it's culturally experimental, right? Everything is new there. It's politically liberal and left-leaning, welcoming to socialists and communists. And of course, it's affordable, and they're able to print these extraordinary books and periodicals and so on. So Berlin, the new capital, was a place of contradictions. It was by day grim, was a city of harsh unemployment, of hyperinflation, of post-war despair. If you take a look at another painting that I put up here by George Gross, titled Twilight, so it's kind of that moment between day and night, you can see the injured man in the back, probably a veteran of the First World War, now rendered homeless. You can see a woman, likely a prostitute, kind of gallivanting in the foreground, and a bourgeois man with a thick cigar who doesn't even seem to care about anyone around him walking behind her. There was this sense in Berlin that things were a mess during the day. The economic situation was grim. The despair and humiliation that came out of the loss of the First World War was palpable. And there was also extreme political tension between communists on the left and nationalists on the right. But by night, Berlin lit up. Its cabarets and theaters were packed to the brim. It had a flourishing avant-garde art scene. It was known for its cinema, so the glitzy silver screen lit up at night. Berlin was really a place of contradictions, a place where day and night were truly opposite. Peter Gay, the historian of Weimar Berlin, described Berlin during this period as a dance on the edge of the volcano. It was completely precarious politically and economically, but so very rich culturally. And Yiddish writers really took advantage of these contradictions. They availed themselves of Berlin's shaky economic situation and also of its cultural richness. And they took advantage of the fact that they could stand out, but also disappear into the background. Peter Gay also wrote that Berlin was hospitable to the stranger, not because it gave them conspicuousness, but also because it allowed them to disappear. And that's exactly what these Yiddish writers were able to do there. So who were these writers? I want to talk to you about a couple of examples and give you a sense of what Berlin meant to them and what they produced while they were in Berlin. So the first is a name probably a lot of you have heard before. Perez Bergelsen, who was arguably the most influential Yiddish writer of his generation. So this is the generation after the so-called drei Klassiker, the three classical Yiddish writers, Mendele, Moishe Kulbak, Sholem Aleichem, and Yud Lamed Peretz. Bergelsen was the next generation and probably the most famous of that generation. And he lived in Berlin longer than any other Yiddish writer of his stature. He lived there for 12 years, from 1921 to 1933. Bergelsen wrote a series of stories that are set in Berlin boarding houses. I've given you an image of the English translation of some of these stories called The Shadows of Berlin, which I highly recommend. Most of these stories are set in the boarding house. This is a setting that you might know from Cabaret, right, inspired by Christopher Isherwood's stories about Weimar Berlin. Bergelsen's fictional boarding house represents the dislocation of Jewish refugees who were exiled from the Yiddish-speaking world, but who also felt exiled within the German-speaking environment in which they had settled. So one of Bergelsen's most famous stories from this period is called Zwischen Immigranten, Among Refugees. And it tells the story of a young Jewish refugee who finds himself living across the hall in the boarding house from a Ukrainian whom he recognizes as being the guy who was responsible for spearheading a pogrom in his hometown. So this is his arch nemesis. And the protagonist becomes obsessed with his neighbor across the hall. He begins to track his every move. He's following him. He wants to know when he comes and when he goes. He's always keeping an eye on when his boots are outside the door. And he eventually plots to assassinate him. But he's unable to carry out this plan because he has no one to help him. He has no way of obtaining a weapon. And this really kind of sheds light on how isolated this Jewish refugee feels in Berlin. And the story begins with him going to a Yiddish writer, who's arguably Bergelsen's alter ego. And he tells him his story and begs the writer to disseminate the story, to write it down and disseminate it. But it becomes clear during their conversation that the protagonist is unable to take action, not just because he has no weapon, but also because of his internal struggle. His sworn enemy is also the person who's actually closest to him, physically and socially. And he starts to feel like he can't live without his enemy. I'll give you just a quote to give you a sense of that. He says, "It was good to know that he was there in the room across from me behind door number 5. And I always felt desolate whenever he went off somewhere and his room remained empty. The hours would stretch and the minutes too. I'd shuffle about my room and through the corridor, and I'd feel, if he doesn't come back in the next few minutes, my heart will explode." It almost sounds like someone pining for a lover, right? Within the boarding house, this Jewish refugee imagines a kind of perverse bond with the Ukrainian murderer. And his obsession emphasizes his foreignness to Berlin, and at the same time, his continued attachment to the place that he has fled from. This story has been read as a kind of story about Bergelsen's own misgivings about his period of exile in Berlin and his apprehensions about returning to Eastern Europe, especially to the Soviet Union, where he ultimately would end up. Now, Bergelsen was what we might call a fellow traveler, someone who supported the Soviet Union, but had some reservations about the Communist Party line, because his real goal was an international Yiddish culture. And the main reason that he supported the Soviet Union was because he believed that was the only place where Yiddish could continue to thrive. In 1926, he wrote an essay about the need to establish an international Yiddish literary center in Moscow. But it's telling that he wrote this essay in Berlin from a safe distance, because it was really unclear at the time how Soviet cultural policies would unfold. And this story that he wrote around the same time among refugees reflects his general anxiety and his unease about the future. Another writer who spent a shorter period of time in Berlin, but a really important and formative time, is Moisha Kulbak. Kulbak arrived in Berlin from the Vilna region. He was from Shmergon, just outside of Vilna. And he arrived in Berlin in 1920. And shortly after arriving, we don't actually have many, aside from his actual published works, we don't really have many of his papers from this period. Very few survive, but there are a couple letters that he wrote from this time. And one of the letters that he wrote in 1920, shortly after arriving in Berlin, was addressed to Shmuel Niger, the prominent Yiddish literary critic who was living in New York. And in the letter begins as follows. Ich bin itzter in Berlin, dos bin ich gekommen in Europa. I am presently in Berlin. Now I have arrived in Europe. I think this is kind of an interesting statement because he was coming from Eastern Europe, but the arrival in Berlin for him was a true arrival in the epicenter, the heartland of European culture. It was a really big deal for him. And in a sense, he wasn't just speaking for himself when he said he had arrived in Europe. He was speaking for Yiddish literature as a whole, because he believed that Berlin was the place where he could freely cultivate a modernist Yiddish literature, a modernist aesthetic in Yiddish. Now, Kulbak is generally remembered as the Yiddish bard of Vilna, and he wrote a very famous poem to Vilna that's almost seen as the Yiddish anthem to Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, Yerushalayim Shalita, Delita, as it was known. So he's remembered as the Yiddish bard of Vilna, but he spent 2 of his most productive years in Berlin. This was both the most prolific time of his life and the loneliest time of his life. He was very much in the shadows of Berlin. He struggled to earn a living there. He was disconnected from the Yiddish literary scene abroad, but at the same time, he felt truly inspired to write. Now, it's interesting that Berlin doesn't really make any appearance in his writing that he produced there, in the writing that he produced in Berlin. None of the writing that he produced in Berlin is actually set there. Instead, it's deeply rooted in Reichen, as White Russia was known in Yiddish. It's rooted in the rural countryside of his youth outside of Vilna. And so I want to give you just an example of one of the poems that he writes in Berlin that, as I said, is not set in Berlin, set rather far away in his imagined Yiddish land in Reichen. And this is a poem, the first poem in a collection of poems that he published in Berlin in 1922, titled Neue Lieder, New Poems. And I will bring it up actually on the screen as well. Hang on, let's see. Sorry, bear with me for a sec. So if you'd like to follow along in the Yiddish or in the English translation, here it is. Ich bin a bocher a hultai. Ich bin a bocher a hultai. Hab ich mir a stecken. Treirerei, ich spann in all de Ecken. Komm ich zu a Kretschme zu, klapp ich an in Teuer. Wer bist du? Entfer ich, a Geher. Ledig Geher a soi fri, chutzpenig verscheiter. Trilili, und ich geh mir weiter. Komm ich zu a Brunnen zu, ich trink sich an mit Wasser. Steh ich in dem Morgengräu wie a Hon an Nasser. Fort a Peurl vorbei. Soche batsch na Svetje, weiß ich nicht und tu a Brei. Svetje, petsche metsche. A youthful rogue am I, a stick held at my side. Tralalai, I travel far and wide. I come upon a little inn and knock against the door. Who are you? Who wants in? I say, a wanderer. Loafer traveling so free, you idle and you squander. Tralali, so I wander farther. Over to the well I stray to drink till thirst is quenched. I stand in graying light of day like a rooster fully drenched. A farmer traveling by greets me with a howdy. I shrug bewildered and reply, howdy, howdy schmowdy. So this poem might sound like a silly nursery rhyme, and it's written in that vein, but it's actually a modernist poem in disguise. The speaker is a Jewish folk hero. He's a mischievous native Eastern European who sings proudly in Yiddish in a diaspora setting. But he's also a penniless idler. He's described as a geyer, a wanderer, but also as a ledig geyer, an idler, a penniless vagabond. His proud stride is deflated in the last stanza by his encounter with a farmer who greets him in Belarusian, says something, and excuse my pronunciation, "Co chibach na sveche," which means something like "what's new in the world," kind of casual greeting. And to the typical reader from the Vilna region, this would sound sort of familiar and foreign. It's clear what language this is and what's being said, but it's also clearly not Yiddish. It's clearly foreign. So the speaker can be seen as a hero of diaspora culture. He's a Jew who sings proudly in Yiddish in this multilingual context, but he's also a completely rootless wanderer who feels linguistically alien to his own native land. So this poem actually introduces a key tension that runs through Kulbak's work, which is the tension between the freedom of diaspora existence and the plight of exile. Ironically, Berlin was the ideal environment for Kulbak to write this kind of poetry, to write this kind of modernist poetry. And we have to remember that Yiddish didn't yet have a poetic tradition. Yiddish literature consisted mainly of satirical and pseudo-folkloric fiction, memoir as well, but it didn't really have a strong poetic tradition. And so Yiddish poets needed to look to other cultural models. And the linguistic resemblances between Yiddish and German made German modernist poetry a natural source of inspiration. And so Berlin was a place where Kulbak was able to cultivate his modernist voice, to soak up modern German poetry, to soak up this cultural stimulation needed to expand a young literary culture. And it also gave him the intellectual freedom to develop his own literary voice. Berlin also provided the distance from his native Vilna region, which was now in the throes of revolution and civil war. And so the combination of inspiration and isolation enabled him to really construct his imagined Yiddish land in poetry. Berlin only makes an appearance in Kulbak's writing after he had left. In 1923, he returned to Vilna, and then he later settled in Soviet Minsk. And there he wrote the mock epic poem, Disner Child Herald, or Child Herald of Disna, which portrays the experiences of an aspiring migrant poet in 1920s Berlin. And the hero of this poem, who's just known as Lulkeman, or pipe man, man with smoking a pipe, leaves his shtetl and he travels to Berlin in search of adventure. But he quickly realizes that life in the big city is not all glitz and glamour. And he learns that Berlin is in the midst of major economic and political upheaval. All around him are signs of decay and bourgeois decadence. So I'll give you just a brief passage from this poem. This is how Kulbak remembers Berlin. Se hält Lulkeman und hält die Dulle Zeit. Berlin vergeht sich in Geschreien. Der alter Michel in die Glecklich schreit. Es schreien die Theaters und Museen. Granach juschet auf der Wasserbiene in Teref. Moisi singt die kranke Blase Ballerine. Und die gestorbene Poesie stinkt. Es ist die Xise von der weiten Breusen. Es ist die Meise, was sie siehst. Expressionism spreist mit reute Fies. Dada mit Arobkilos der Häusen. Pipe man listens, hears an age gone mad. Berlin fades and screams. Old bourgeoisie screaming in bells, screaming in the theaters and museums. Granach rushes on a barren stage in madness. Moisi croons like a pale, sickly ballerina, and dead poetry stinks. The dying body of a distant glimmer, its demise is sweet. Expressionism treads on red feet. Dada with its pants down. So the poem gives us a scathing critique of bourgeois culture in Weimar Berlin, and it carries ultimately a pro-communist message if you read the poem to the end. But it's also a big departure from the style that was typical of Soviet Yiddish literature being produced in Minsk at the time, which was mainly socialist realism. It's written in this dark, ironic German expressionist style. So Kulbak's Soviet poem actually reflects Weimar cynicism, Weimar wit. It couldn't have been produced without Kulbak having been in Berlin, having spent time there and soaked up the influences there. For both Kulbak and Bergelsen, Berlin was a site of exile, and exile fueled their creativity. In that way, they're not unlike the lost generation of Americans in Paris, like Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald. These Yiddish modernists, finding themselves in Berlin rather than Paris, were isolated and enriched by the experience of exile. Berlin gave them the inspiration and also the anonymity that they needed to develop new forms of modernist culture. All this came to a fairly swift end. When Hitler forcibly took power in Germany in 1933, the golden years of Weimar Berlin came to an abrupt end. All in all, the Weimar Republic lasted for about 13 years, a very short but rich period in history. Republican democracy collapsed. Actually, it didn't just collapse, it was destroyed by fascistic forces for which democracy had paved the way. As the capital of an unstable democracy, the existence of a democratic liberal Berlin was always on the threshold of collapse. The Hebrew poet Leah Goldberg, who herself spent time in Berlin in the 30s, described it as a solid city suspended over nothing, a city of peace and freedom on the edge of the bloody abyss. Thankfully, the cosmopolitan legacy of Berlin during the interwar period outlived the existence of the Weimar Republic itself. And this legacy was in part created by immigrants like Kulbak and Bergelsen. The literature that they produced in exile between the wars was a homeless literature, but also a worldly literature. It was untethered by narrow forms of nationalism. So why should we care about Yiddish in Weimar Berlin? This seemingly obscure moment in history really couldn't be more relevant today. With the rise of ethnic nationalism, even white supremacism all over the world, including in the United States, right? We're just a couple of days away from an election that has brought this issue to the forefront. We're really forced to think about how democracy can collapse under the weight of fascistic forces. And so we're also forced to think about what's lost when that happens. And all the more reason to remember this Jewish culture that once thrived in this place. Today's Berlin bears the legacy of interwar Jewish culture in another way. Berlin is the site of an interesting kind of Jewish renewal or Jewish revival right now. And just like the Jewish culture of 100 years ago, this is largely thanks to the arrival of Jewish immigrants from North America, from the former Soviet Union, and from Israel. And there's a major phenomenon now of Israelis in Berlin. The new experimental Jewish art that's being produced in Berlin isn't being produced today in Yiddish, but it carries the influence. And I want to just conclude my talk by giving you one example of a contemporary Jewish artist based in Berlin who is really drawing on the history of Yiddish culture in Berlin. Her name is Ella Ponizovsky Bergelsen. This is no coincidence because she's the great granddaughter of David Bergelsen. She's a young Israeli artist, was born in Moscow and raised in Israel. And she left Israel for Berlin because of her frustration with current Israeli politics. But she says that she only became really interested in her family history and her family's connection to Berlin upon arriving there. She's made the story among refugees, zwischen Immigranten, the focus of one of her current projects, which she calls Among Refugees, Generation Y. And it's a series of multilingual calligraphy murals that are placed in sort of strategic places throughout the neighborhoods of Neukölln and Kreuzberg, neighborhoods in Berlin that are known for having a strong immigrant presence, primarily Turkish, but also other immigrant communities. And these murals merge German, Hebrew, Russian, and Arabic script. These are languages that are central to the artist's biography, but they're also present in Berlin's immigrant enclaves today. And these murals explore the implicit ties among refugees and exiles from various cultural and national backgrounds. And I'll just show you what these look like, a couple of examples. So these are two studies that she did where she actually extracted quotes from the Bergelsen story, Zwischen Emigranten, and then uses her hybrid script that blends Cyrillic, Latin letters, Arabic letters, and Hebrew letters. And here is an image of her painting one of these murals in the neighborhood Kreuzberg. So people like Ella Ponizovsky Bergelsen are looking back to Yiddish culture in the interwar period, not simply as a lost relic, but as a source of promise and a source of inspiration. And their fascination with this chapter in Jewish history really reminds us that Yiddish still has something to teach us today, and that Yiddish isn't simply a thing of the past. Yiddish was once young and vibrant in Berlin, and it's providing inspiration for young artists still today. So with that, I will conclude, and I welcome your questions in English or in Yiddish. And I believe that Anastasia is going to field the questions, correct?
Yes. Rachel, I would like to thank you for this wonderful and rich talk. I think, you brought together visual culture and, linguistic expression also in other languages that are the languages of current refugees and immigrants in Berlin. So that was wonderful, sort of weaving the strands together. We have a couple questions, but if I may just sort of follow up on your conclusion and also on Bergelsen's story. So I'm really curious when you mentioned Ponizovsky Bergelsen's murals and the English translation. So was that from Naigroshel's translation of the story, or was it a remake?
Yeah, no, so she herself does not read Yiddish. She doesn't know Yiddish. Yeah. She relied on Naigroshel's translation. And she actually says that she didn't even know, she knew that her great-grandfather had been some writer, but she didn't really know how important a writer he was until she made the decision to go to Berlin herself and kind of became curious about this part of her family history. So in a way, she was just being exposed to it the way anyone who's studies Yiddish literature and translation does today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, it strikes me that there's this almost expressionist aesthetic to her murals, which kind of was illuminating, seeing all the other expressionist art that you shared. And I'm also wondering if you see sort of reverberations of Zwischen Emigranten, that story that was set in Berlin, and the later pogrom stories that Bergelsen published, for instance, in Sturm Tag, much later. You sort of talked about, that the fact that this was the story set in a boarding house in Berlin, but obviously it also reflects Bergelsen's experiences during the Civil War in Ukraine and the pogroms that happened. And what's really striking too is that in Bergelsen, as Harriet Murav pointed out, oftentimes the things or the objects speak really loud, even sometimes louder than the protagonists of the story, and sort of this obsession, with, like you said, with the shoes of this arch nemesis and whatnot comes to the fore. So I'm wondering if there's also some sort of connection between that story and his later work in Sturm Tag as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I haven't for a long time read his later stories, so I can't really comment on any specific ties. But what I can say is that I do think he was working out a lot of his aesthetic and thematic concerns in Berlin that would carry over into the later writing as well, because he was already publishing in Span. He was already identifying as a Soviet Yiddish writer, just living in exile, and so he's preoccupied with the same things that he would later be kind of figuring out. But what's I think particularly interesting about Zwischen den Migranten is the way that it operates as a framed tale, because you have the story of this refugee who actually describes himself as a Jewish terrorist because he wants to go off and murder his nemesis, right? So you have his story, but it's also his story that takes place in Berlin in the here and now. But then you also have the story of the shtetl, of the past, of the pogroms that are kind of refracted through his telling of his what he has to share with this Jewish writer that he goes to visit. And so that's what Bergelsen does so brilliantly, is he kind of gives us this really uncertain limbo type of present moment in Berlin. But he also is giving us, in kind of just little bits and pieces, the history of why this character is even experiencing this dilemma to begin with, what he's even doing there. So he kind of oscillates in this really interesting way through the frame tale between Eastern Europe and Berlin. And that's something that you don't see in the same way in the later writing, but it shows us what his concerns are, what his primary concerns are, right? But yeah, and yes, about the objects. I mean, doors, boots, even the way that people's own bodies are described, that he focuses in on one cheek or on one eye, you know. So yeah, that is very characteristic of Bergelsen, yeah.
Thank you. We have a question from Benjamin Rubin. I've just unmuted you. Please go ahead.
You mentioned that there was a journalist from the Forward from New York who was in Berlin, but I was reading about the explosion of the press in general in Berlin, and was wondering, was there a Jewish journalism, Jewish daily newspaper or weekly newspaper? I know in Winnipeg in the 1920s, there was a full newspaper published in Yiddish every week, with journalists and ads in Yiddish and a whole sub world of Yiddish.
Yeah, no, there was a very rich Yiddish press in Berlin, and it wasn't just, I mean, I mentioned that it was, you know, the place where a quarter of Yiddish books were printed mainly for export at the time, but there were also Yiddish dailies, Yiddish weeklies. There were a number of different periodicals, but the vast majority of things that were published in Yiddish in Berlin were published for export. It was sort of, you might think of it, the city more as a kind of publisher's clearinghouse than as a proper literary center that was catering to a local audience. And it's kind of interesting that even someone like Kulbak, he wrote in one of these letters to Shmuel Niger, who was in New York, that he had just published some poems in a Yiddish anthology, but he couldn't get a copy of it in Berlin. There was no way to get it there. So it's kind of interesting that so many things were coming out of Berlin, but they were being sent to America or to other parts of Europe. And that was that was part of the kind of existential dilemma that a lot of the Yiddish writers who were based there were facing, that they felt like they had a lot of opportunity there, but they also felt quite disconnected.
Thank you.
You can ask your questions in the chat, or you may unmute yourself or start your video as well. While we were waiting for some questions, I just wanted to read two comments from Anna Guancher, who mentioned that Yiddish culture is also being produced in Berlin today. And then there was a comment too about Kulbak's poem, I believe, that it's also set to music and quite a popular song.
I'll maybe just add to her comment about Yiddish culture being produced in Berlin today. It's true, not maybe so much strictly as literature, but definitely Yiddish music, especially klezmer. There's a really rich klezmer scene in Berlin that's being produced not just by Jewish musicians, but also by German and other European non-Jewish musicians who have really taken to the style of music. One kind of interesting Jewish musician based there is Daniel Kahn, whom some of you might know from the latest Fiddler on the Roof Yiddish, the Yiddish version of Fiddler on the Roof that's been staged in New York. He performed in that, but he also performs with a klezmer band called the Painted Bird, and produces wonderful music in Yiddish, in German, in English, sometimes in a combination, and performs regularly in Berlin. So there is still Yiddish to be heard in Berlin for sure.
And Claire Adam had a similar question if there are any younger people writing in Yiddish, and she also mentioned that there is a renaissance of studying Yiddish and Ashkenaz festival.
Yeah, I don't know of any younger people who are writing in Yiddish. I know about younger people who are inspired by Yiddish, the Yiddish of the past, to create new forms of art, and like someone like Ella Ponizovsky Bergelsen, who's kind of incorporating traces of Yiddish into her visual art. But I'd be very happy to be pleasantly surprised if someone told me about anybody writing in Yiddish in Berlin today. But certainly you are able to learn Yiddish in Berlin. There are festivals, Yiddish concerts in Berlin. And there's also a very strong presence of Jews from the former Soviet Union in Berlin, many of whom are kind of involved in this sort of renewal of interest in Yiddish. There's actually one interesting phenomenon is Yiddish speakers like the former Orthodox Jewish author Deborah Feldman, who wrote the book Unorthodox, who now lives in Berlin. And one of the reasons she says she was able to move to Berlin was because she's a native Yiddish speaker from the Hasidic community in Brooklyn. And the learning German wasn't such a challenge for her. So she's actually based there, not writing in Yiddish, but comes from a Yiddish speaking background. So the linguistic proximity, obviously, between Yiddish and German is still something that's relevant.
There's a question from Jonathan about the relationship between the Eastern European and Western European Jews, German Jews. Would you like to ask the question?
Yes, I can see.
Yes, but you have to unmute me.
You're unmuted.
You're unmuted.
We hear you.
Oh, I think you, Jonathan, I think you might have muted yourself.
Okay, now I'm okay.
Now we hear you. Hello.
Yeah, okay. Hello, how are you?
Good.
Calling you from Israel. We know that there's always bad blood between Ostjuden, Eastern Jews, and German Jews. The way you describe it, I want to know whether this Yiddish group or the Yiddish writers in between the world wars, were they a class unto themselves, or did they really have also a relationship with the regular German Jews, or was it sort of an island of Eastern European Jews in Berlin?
So you're giving me such a great segue to say, go read my book. This is kind of very much what the book is about the relationship between East European Jews and German Jews in Berlin at the time. And the way I describe it in the book is I say, in many ways, this is the story of a missed encounter, that they didn't really come into contact in a very meaningful way, but there were some very prominent exceptions. One of them is Bergelsen. Bergelsen became quite close, for example, with Alfred Döblin, the very assimilated German Jewish writer, who's famous for the novel Berlin Alexanderplatz, in which he describes the Scheunenviertel, the Jewish quarter. and they even collaborated on things and became, had quite a close relationship. And that's also partly because Bergelsen was a more established writer. He was more well off than people like Kulbak. He lived in Berlin for 12 years, so he was able to make these connections that others maybe weren't able to. And there are also examples of German Jewish writers and East European Jews meeting in the Berlin cafe scene. People like Uri Zvi Greenberg becoming friends with Else Lasker-Schuler. Apparently, the story goes that he asked her if she wanted him to translate some of her German poems into Hebrew. And she said, well, I already wrote them in Hebrew, because she had this sort of weird fantasy that even though she was a German writer, she was actually writing in Hebrew, because her soul was, she had a Yiddish neshama. So there are these kind of stories of these exceptions, but mostly it was a kind of missed encounter, which is interesting because East European Jews were so fascinated by and influenced by German culture, and vice versa. German Jews were really in this period, especially those who were influenced by people like Martin Buber and his Hasidic tales, were really curious about Eastern Europe and about the kind of authentic Jewish culture that they believed existed there. So they were looking at one another, at sort of idealized versions of one another, but weren't necessarily meeting in the flesh. And that's part of the fascination, I think, of Berlin. It was a place so big and so decentralized and so sprawling that there were all these different pockets of culture, that were thriving there, not necessarily in contact with one another.
Thank you.
I think we'll take one last question from Bernard Katz, or a request for clarification. Please go ahead. I just unmuted you, and I think you might have muted yourself.
Okay, how's that? Am I coming through?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, thank you. My question is related to what you said. You were talking about the open and modernist culture that included Yiddish writers collapsed, and I believe your words were when Hitler forcibly took power in 1933. But surely Hitler did not forcibly take power in 1933. He was named chancellor by President Hindenburg in January, and he gradually took more and more power and control, especially after a further election in March that followed the Reichstag fire in February. And it was only in July that the Nazi Party was declared the only legal political party. And the process was, as man sagt in Yiddish, zubisslich. His rise to power was accommodated all the way along without any need for force.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a very good point, and I appreciate the clarification. One thing, what Hitler did shortly after being named chancellor was to declare a state of emergency, which allowed him to accrue more and more power than would have otherwise been possible under the Republican Constitution. So you're absolutely right. It wasn't just that he swooped in and there was a coup and he forcibly took control. This was something that the kind of mechanisms that democracy had put in place actually allowed for, ironically. But I guess what I meant by that is that by declaring a state of emergency, he was able to establish suddenly a totalitarian regime in what had previously been a democratic state.
Well, thank you. And one other remark I would like to make has to do with this, dare I call it, stress between the established German Jewish community, which in so many ways was assimilated, or if you like, progressive. After all, Reform Judaism began in Germany, and the Eastern European Jewish community. And we can see this is reflected in the United States, where the influx of Eastern European Jews in the late 19th and early 20th century particularly in the late 19th century, was reacted against by so many German Jews who had immigrated to the United States earlier. And also in Canada, we had a very similar kind of situation, and also in Britain. So this, what shall I call it, tension between the established German Jewish community and these quote unquote newcomers who were rearing up in so many different ways culturally, modernistically, and in the view of the established German Jewish community, very negatively, kept them apart.
Yeah, those are, I think, very interesting parallels. And in all of the cases that you mentioned, I think it often comes down to this whole question of who was here first, right? Certainly American Jews, this idea that the Jewish immigrants from Germany arrived earlier, became assimilated, became more upwardly mobile, and then were ashamed of the poor Eastern European non-English Jews who arrived later. And you see a similar thing in the German context, for sure. There's a line. I mean, I think the thing that sums it up the best. There's a great line in a novel by Shai Agnon that takes place in Berlin in the First World War. One of the characters says, "Everybody is somebody's Ostjude." Mm-hmm. That the East European Jew is always sort of the maligned other who comes later, who is seen as less worthy, a source of embarrassment. But one of the things that's so interesting about the period that I was talking about today is that you also see the flip side. You also see a lot of German Jews in this period becoming really fascinated by East European Jewish culture as kind of the bastion of everything that they had lost in the process of assimilating into German culture, everything that they had relinquished for the sake of becoming as German as the Germans. And so although there is this kind of tension and animosity, on the one hand, you also see many examples of a kind of romantic fascination with East European Jews on the part of German Jews.
That's very interesting. Who was buying all of these Yiddish printed books?
People outside of Germany. So they this was a culture made for export. And the majority of books, at least, that were published in Yiddish in Berlin were being sent to America, being sent back to Poland. So there wasn't a strong local audience.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And on that historical, but also very contemporary note, I would like to thank Rachel Seelig for a wonderful talk today. A schönem Dank euch und a schönem Dank alle men fahren kommen. And I would really like to encourage you to read Dr. Seelig's work, her scholarship, and in particular her book, Strangers in Berlin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.